Today I'm going to talk about the challenges of shortening the settlement cycle. Now, this has been a topic of discussion in 2021. The first quarter has been littered with regulators, industry practitioners, vendors, all sorts talking about the settlement cycle in the US, in Europe. There's been a lot of discussion. So I think setting some groundwork for why there are challenges in shortening the settlement cycle from what we have at the moment, which is trade date plus 2 days, T+2. Why does it take so long to settle a trade? Well, we trade in microseconds and it takes 2 days to settle a trade. Rightly so, people do ask what's up with that. Why is it so slow? Why, when we're sort of a high-speed train at the start of the trade, do we slow down to a steam train when it comes to settlement and the clearing process as well in the middle? So there are very good reasons as to why we trade on T+2, and it is most of the world that's on a T+2 settlement cycle. So if you look at my Firebrand Research map here, you can see most of the world is on T+2, which is dark orange, but not every single market is on T+2. We do have T+1 in some markets there in yellow. We do have T+3 in certain markets as well, particularly in Africa, in the Middle East, and some parts of Asia as well. And believe it or not, we even have a T+0 settlement cycle in a few markets, including China, but that's for domestic trading activities. Generally, when markets are relatively insular, they tend to have shorter settlement cycles or longer settlement cycles, depending on the market practices. But most of the world, as I say, is on T+2. It's not just the US and it's not just Europe. One of the biggest challenges when it comes to shortening the settlement cycle is that no one really wants to spend their money on the industry plumbing. It's painful, it takes a long time to change, just like the plumbing in your house. No one wants to spend on it unless it's leaking all over the place and you've got some sort of problem that you need to fix. So cost-saving business cases are generally what you have to put in front of your senior executives to get approval, and cost-saving is not always a particularly convincing argument. Revenue-generating arguments tend to work much better with C-suite executives, understandably so, especially when it comes to gaining new clients rather than protecting revenue or reducing cost or risk. Unfortunately, is not quite as convincing unless you've had, as I say, some kind of incident that has brought it to the attention of the C-suite. Also, costs can be incredibly high, and you can see a lot of unhappy faces out there when you talk about moving from your batch overnight processes to a much shorter time frame, particularly if it looks like real time, which is a really big jump. And this is not just in terms of technology, this is also operational and process rework. So understanding your flows, adopting new market practices, perhaps wholesale if you wanted to move to a really short settlement cycle. That includes working with your clients, because if you think about it, you're not just one individual firm. You have to work within our financial institutions are all very interconnected. You have to deal with your clients as well. So if you're automating on one side and they aren't automated on the other, you can have problems there when it comes to matching trades and confirming trades and all of these very important things that need to happen to reduce operational risk. So thinking about also retiring legacy systems, we've talked about sunsetting systems for a long period of time. It's not necessarily very easy. And when you think about the community out there, you might have your large clients who are relatively automated, and then you have a long tail of counterparts and clients that may not have any sort of automation in place. They may be working with Excel spreadsheets and the like, so and sending emails back and forth. So you have to take that into account too. Not every financial institution out there or counterparty out there is at the same stage of evolution when it comes to adoption of technology or from maturity of process standpoint either. They may not be using industry standards, things like that. So you've really got to think about the fact that we're not at a level playing field here. Some firms have invested heavily already, and we really do need to think about that. There are also vested interests to consider. Money comes into this. You think about moving to real-time settlement, you get rid of a lot of different opportunities and things that happen in the market out there, such as securities lending. Some firms make a huge amount of money out of the securities lending process. If you remove that from the industry, it's going to make quite a few different financial institutions quite unhappy unless they find revenue or recoup revenue in another way. So there are more than a few institutions out there that would be negatively impacted by such a dramatic change. rather than a more restrained one, let's say moving to a T+1 or T+1/2, which will retain some of the opportunities for the engagement out there. There are also interdependencies to consider. Again, as I say, we're an interconnected market. There are lots of different cogs out there. We all connect to each other. You can't just update equity security settlement in isolation, right? You've got to think about the fact we've got FX, we've got payment systems, we're a cross-border market, we're a global market. You're not just talking about one, as I showed the map. The reason why so many different places on that map have an orange T+2 settlement cycle is because they've come into, they deal with each other regularly. It's much easier when everything is on the same settlement cycle. So there are numerous moving parts out there in our interconnected, I hate to say the word ecosystem, but community of different financial institutions across the globe that need to work in concert with each other and not all in the same space. So this is something we need to take into account. We need to think about how the FX market will have to shorten its own cycles. We'll have to think about modernising the payment systems out there and understanding that cross-border counterparties will be impacted too, and how do you get everybody on the same page together. Again, as I said, markets are global. Building on that point, we don't just have equities domestic trading. It happens. There's a lot of firms that do focus only on domestic, but you have to think about the impact on international markets out there. The US, think about it, when we moved in the US to T+2, that was 3 years after Europe had made the move. And the only reason Europe made the move was because we had a piece of regulation called the CSD regulation that compelled the industry to move to a shorter settlement cycle from T+3 down to T+2. So it wasn't by industry choice by any stretch of the imagination. It was sort of compulsion that made the various regions move. So that's something else to bear in mind. We are a global market. We must always remember that. There are obviously lots of benefits of shortening the settlement cycle, and we have to think about those, because if we're going to make a business case, we need to think about why we should shorten it. So settlement risk is probably the most important there. If you think about insolvency at a basic level, the more risk there is, the longer the period of time in between trading and settlement, the more risk there is, because one of those counterparties could become insolvent in that period of time, and overall institutional trade exposure is higher the longer it sits out there. So there's also settlement and systemic risk for infrastructures as well, and sitting in the middle, CSDs out there, ICS, international CSDs, and there's also the benefits, if you think about it from a cost perspective, of reducing your capital and margining requirements. If you remove some of the risk, then that brings down those requirements in concert with that, because those risks reduce, and therefore those costs reduce. So that's something that's going to be mentioned by a lot of proponents of moving to T+1, for example, and that's an important, these are important considerations, because risk and cost, obviously, we always want to reduce them, even if it's hard to build a business case, always based only on those considerations. And when it comes to regulators, you do have to weigh the costs against the benefits. So it's a balancing act here. You can't just move wholesale into one area without weighing the cost to the industry. And this means all the players, as I say, not everybody's going to have the same level of cost. You have to look across the spectrum of different firms against the risks that are posed by moving from one settlement cycle to another. So if we look at the risks and the costs here, we need to compel a lot of smaller firms to automate. They may not have the budgets that are available to be able to automate. So how do you help those firms move towards a more automated environment? We'll have to obviously invest heavily in the post-trade space within each institutional client, and each bank, each broker will have to invest, as well as all the micro infrastructures out there and some of the vendors as well. So it impacts everybody, and everybody will have to invest in post-trade and security settlement systems. This may obviously, unfortunately, entail retiring some of those legacy systems, those batch processes that we have. Especially if they're not able to keep up with a volume increase, if you're shortening the settlement cycle and having to push more volume through on a day rather than 2 days. So that's something to bear in mind. There is also market practice changes that have to happen in the middle office, and this is where I talk about electronic trade matching. Many firms will use centralized platforms for this kind of stuff. So other firms will be using, in-house technology, and some firms, as I say, will be interchanging using manual processes, people, email, mapping things with Excel spreadsheets, and that's a huge amount of change that needs to happen there to move those firms into more standardized processes. And we also have to think about the potential revenue impacts. As I say, if market practices change, sometimes opportunities change in size, and in obviously it doesn't impact everybody in the same ways. So you need to think about all those kinds of negative impacts that can happen when it comes to looking at different settlement cycles. And again, I'll reiterate, changes to FX liquidity and collateral management will also cost money. You can't just change your equity space, you have to change everything that's linked to that. So, and this could also involve corporate actions and things like that. It could any technology within the middle or back office could be impacted that touches upon this area. So, and if you think about real time, there's a lot of benefits to netting out there. Rather than having money flowing back and forth in real time, the idea of netting is that you can net one position off against another, so you don't actually have to do massive transactions in real time all the time, which is a benefit to the industry. It reduces operational risk not to have to do that. So there's a benefit to not being real time, believe it or not. So that's one thing, again, that I think the industry has to take in consideration. But if I'm going to summarise the benefits, operational risk reduction, that's definitely something that we want to see, and it's very important. We've talked a lot about operational resilience in the crisis at the moment. That's something that's top of mind for regulators, top of mind for the industry. So that's a very important consideration. Counterparty credit risk reduction, again, has an impact on reduced margining requirements. So those two go hand in hand. So that's definitely something very important to consider in terms of risk and cost. In terms of settlement problems, you have to be, you'll be faster at resolving them if it's a shorter period of time. And that's something that you really do want to reduce more risk and more problems as you go forward. So, and reduced capital requirements, again, another benefit, and the efficiency gains of moving to a different settlement cycle. Obviously, there are lots of benefits, but something the industry has to consider. The regulators have to consider, and this is why it's so important to speak to the SEC, ESMA, anyone that's considering this particular move, and keep in the loop alongside all of the different players in the market. And as I say, this is just a high-level overview of some of the challenges out there. There are many more. So please do keep an eye on Firebrand Research, and we'll make sure to keep you in the loop of all the different dynamics in the market.